It happened in the kitchen, standing in front of the sink, with my hands under running water that had already turned cold. I remember noticing that first, the temperature, not sharply, not as a discomfort exactly, just as a distant fact, like someone mentioning the weather in another room. The water kept hitting my knuckles, sliding over my palms, pooling briefly before disappearing down the drain. I didn't move to adjust it. I didn't pull my hands away. I just stood there, watching the way the skin at my fingertips looked slightly pale under the fluorescent light. Behind me, the refrigerator hummed with a steady mechanical patience. It was a sound I had heard every day for years but rarely noticed. That morning it seemed unusually loud, like it had stepped forward into the center of the room. My phone buzzed on the counter. I didn't turn to look at it. It buzzed again, then stopped. I knew who it was without checking. I knew what the message said without reading it. And what I noticed most, what felt strange in a way I couldn't immediately name, was the absence of anything rising inside me in response. No tightening in my chest, no irritation, no pull toward urgency, just a flat, quiet stillness. At the time, I interpreted that stillness as something clean, almost admirable. I remember thinking, with a faint sense of pride, this is what it means to be grounded. The thought itself came softly, without words at first, just a recognition that I was not being pulled around by emotion the way I used to be. I was not reacting. I was not spiraling. I was not reaching for distraction or escape. I was simply standing there. Present. That was the word I used back then. Present. The water kept running. I watched it slide over the thin scar across my left hand, a pale line from years earlier. The skin there looked almost translucent, like it belonged to someone else. I flexed my fingers slightly, feeling the movement in a distant, observational way. The phone buzzed again. Still, I didn't move. There was a strange heaviness in my arms, as though they belonged to gravity more than to me. Not painful, not numb exactly, just thick, like moving through air that had quietly turned dense. I remember noticing that my breathing was shallow, but even that observation didn't carry concern. It was simply something to register, like noticing a cloud pass across a window. After a while, I don't know how long, I turned off the faucet. The sudden absence of sound felt louder than the water had been. The room seemed to expand into the silence. I stood there, hands wet, droplets forming at the edges of my fingertips before falling one by one into the sink. And still, nothing moved inside me. I remember testing it, almost experimentally. I thought about the message again. I imagined the tone it would carry. I replayed the last conversation in my head. The way voices had tightened, the way the air had shifted between us. There should have been something. A knot, a resistance, an ache. Instead, there was the same flat quiet. At the time, I interpreted that quiet as strength, as evidence that I had grown beyond old patterns. I had spent years practicing not getting caught in emotional storms. And now here it was, the calm I had worked so hard to cultivate. But even in that moment, something felt slightly off. Not wrong exactly, just thin, like the silence in the room wasn't spacious, but hollow. I remember noticing how still my face felt, as if the muscles had forgotten their range of movement. I tried to smile slightly, just to see if it felt natural. The expression appeared, but it didn't connect to anything behind it. It felt like placing an object onto a surface, rather than something emerging from within. The refrigerator hummed again. A car passed outside, tires moving slowly over wet pavement. I stood there longer than I needed to, staring at nothing in particular, feeling that same unmoving quiet inside me. And twice, once while the water was running, and once after I had turned off, the same subtle thought drifted through my mind, almost too soft to catch. This doesn't feel alive. I dismissed it immediately both times. I told myself that what I was feeling wasn't emptiness. It was peace. I believed that completely. Or at least, I believed it enough not to look any closer. The belief didn't arrive suddenly. It formed gradually, the way a path appears in a field, not because someone planned it, but because it's walked over and over until the grass no longer grows there. In the beginning, it felt like relief. Years earlier, I had lived in a constant state of internal noise. Small interactions could linger inside me for hours. A brief change in someone's tone could replay in my mind for days. I carried emotions in my body like weight: tight shoulders, restless sleep, a stomach that clenched without warning. Back then, I thought this intensity meant I was deeply connected to life, but it also exhausted me. So when I first learned to step back from that constant surge of feeling, it felt like stepping out of a crowded, overheated room into cool air. I remember the first time I noticed it clearly. Someone I cared about had said something sharp during an argument, words that would have once cut deeply, triggering waves of self-doubt and defensiveness. But that day, I felt something different. There was space between their words and my reaction. I could hear what they were saying without being pulled into it. I didn't rush to defend myself. I didn't collapse inward. I just listened, calm and steady, as if their emotions were passing, whether that didn't belong to me. Afterward, I felt proud of that calm. I told myself, this is what maturity looks like. Over time, that calm became something I actively cultivated. I learned to pause before responding, to observe my thoughts instead of identifying with them, to let emotional surges pass without feeding them. And each time I did this, I felt reinforced by the quiet that followed. Friends noticed it too. They would say things like, "You're so centered," or "I wish I could stay as calm as you." I remember how those comments landed, not as arrogance, but as confirmation that I was moving in the right direction, that I was becoming less reactive, more stable, more present. I began to trust that state more than any emotional intensity. When sadness arose, I learned to watch it rather than sink into it. When anger flickered, I let it pass without expression. When anxiety stirred, I labeled it quietly and returned my attention to my breath, my surroundings, the neutral sensations of my body. Each time, the same pattern followed. The feeling would fade and a smooth, quiet stillness would settle in its place. That stillness became my reference point. It felt safe, predictable, clean. I started to interpret any strong emotion as something slightly suspect, something that indicated attachment, imbalance, or a loss of awareness. So when I noticed myself becoming less emotionally reactive over time, I took it as proof that I was growing, that I was seeing beyond the illusions that once controlled me. I repeated certain phrases internally, not as formal mantras, but as quiet reassurances. This will pass. You are not your feelings. Stay with what is here. Those phrases brought a familiar sense of control. They helped me return quickly to that calm baseline whenever something stirred inside me. And gradually, that baseline shifted. What once had felt like a spacious awareness began to feel more like a constant neutrality. I didn't question it at first. It felt stable, reliable. Even when situations around me grew emotionally charged, conflict at work, tension in relationships, I found myself able to remain steady. I listened carefully, responded thoughtfully, rarely raised my voice, rarely showed visible distress. People often describe me as composed. I like that word. Composed suggested intention, balance, mastery. It meant I was not at the mercy of passing moods. Over time, I came to equate composure with presence itself. If I was calm, I was present. If I was undisturbed, I was aware. If I felt neutral, I assumed I was free. There were moments, small ones, when something inside me felt faintly disconnected. A slight delay between an event and any emotional resonance. A sense that reactions that once would have moved through me now passed by without touching anything. But each time that happened, I interpreted it as progress. I told myself I had simply outgrown old emotional habits, that I was no longer entangled in unnecessary drama, that I was finally living from a deeper, steadier place. And because that interpretation fit so well with everything I had practiced and everything others affirmed, it felt completely convincing. It felt not just true, but necessary, like a foundation I had carefully built, brick by brick, over years. I never considered that what I was standing on might not be ground at all, only that it was quiet beneath my feet. The first crack wasn't dramatic. It didn't arrive with a confrontation or a sudden breakdown. It appeared in a moment so ordinary that I almost missed it entirely. I was sitting across from someone who was crying, not loudly, not uncontrollably, just quiet tears that slid down their face as they tried to explain something that mattered to them. Their voice trembled slightly, pausing in the middle of sentences as they tried to steady themselves. I remember watching them carefully. I listened to every word. I maintained eye contact. I nodded at the right moments. My posture was open, attentive. Outwardly, I was fully present. But inside, there was nothing moving toward them. No softening in my chest. No urge to reach out. No ache in response to their pain. Just the same neutral stillness I had come to trust. I noticed it briefly, the absence of feeling, and immediately I reframed it. I told myself that staying calm allowed me to support them better, that if I became emotionally overwhelmed, I wouldn't be able to hold space for what they were experiencing. So I stayed steady. I spoke gently. I offered thoughtful responses. I said the things I believed would help. But at one point, they stopped talking and looked at me in a way that lingered longer than usual. Their eyes searched my face. And quietly, almost apologetically, they said, "I can't tell what you feel." The words didn't land as an accusation. They were said softly, more like confusion than complaint. Still, something inside me tightened for a moment. I dismissed it quickly. I told myself they were simply projecting their own need for emotional validation, that my calmness might feel unfamiliar to them because they were used to more reactive exchanges. So I returned to my usual explanation. I'm just being present. I'm not shutting down. I'm staying grounded. I repeated that to myself later that night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. But the memory of their voice, "I can't tell what you feel," kept resurfacing. Each time it did, I responded the same way internally. Feeling isn't necessary to understand. You don't have to absorb someone's pain to care about them. Presence is not emotional reaction. Those explanations had always worked before. They usually restored the sense of certainty I relied on. But this time, they didn't fully settle the unease. Something remained slightly unsettled, like a small vibration beneath the surface. I noticed similar moments in the weeks that followed. During a conversation that should have excited me, I felt polite interest, but no genuine spark. When someone shared good news, I smiled and congratulated them, but the warmth didn't travel beyond my face. When conflict arose, I remained composed, but afterward, I felt strangely detached, as if the entire interaction had happened behind glass. Each time, I returned to my practices. I slowed my breathing. I observed my thoughts. I reminded myself not to identify with emotional fluctuations. And each time, I succeeded in restoring the familiar calm. But that calm no longer felt as solid. It felt thinner, like a surface stretched over something hollow. One evening, the same person who had cried earlier confronted me gently about it. We were sitting in silence after a long day, the room dim except for a small lamp casting a warm circle of light between us. They said, carefully choosing their words, "Sometimes it feels like you're not really here with me, like you're watching from somewhere else." The statement wasn't harsh. It carried sadness more than anger. I felt a brief surge of defensiveness rise inside me. I almost responded immediately, ready to explain that I was simply calm, that I wasn't caught in emotional reactivity the way I used to be. But something stopped me. I hesitated, and in that hesitation, I noticed something I had never fully acknowledged before. It didn't feel like I was calmly present. It felt like I was slightly removed, as if I were sitting just behind my own eyes, observing everything from a step back. The realization didn't fully form into words at the time. It just lingered as an uncomfortable sensation. And when I tried, as I always did, to return to my usual reassurances, this is awareness, this is grounding, they didn't land with the same certainty. They felt rehearsed, familiar, but no longer convincing. The quiet that followed wasn't peaceful. It felt strangely empty. And for the first time, I couldn't completely tell myself that emptiness was the same as presence. The shift didn't happen all at once. There was no moment when everything suddenly became clear. Instead, the familiar certainty I had relied on began to loosen quietly, like threads unraveling from fabric, so slowly you don't notice until the structure changes. I returned often to the memory of the kitchen sink, standing there, hands under cold water, feeling nothing move inside me. At first, I still tried to interpret that moment as evidence of calm, but When I revisited it more honestly, something about it felt different. The stillness hadn't been spacious. It had been heavy, muted, like sound absorbed by thick walls. I noticed other small moments from the past with the same new awareness. Times when someone laughed and I responded appropriately, but didn't feel the laughter resonate in my body. Moments when sadness arose around me and I remained steady, not because I could hold it, but because it never touched me at all. Each time I looked back, I felt a subtle discomfort growing. It wasn't dramatic, just a quiet sense that what I called presence might have been something else entirely. I didn't replace that belief with a new one. I didn't arrive at a clear explanation. Instead, I found myself sitting more often in uncertainty. I noticed that when emotions arose, even faint ones, my old habit was to observe them from a distance until they faded. But now, when I tried to do that, it felt incomplete, like I was stepping away too quickly. So sometimes I did nothing. I let the feeling remain without analyzing it, without labeling it, without trying to dissolve it. Those moments felt uncomfortable, messy, unstable. There were times I wanted to return immediately to the clean neutrality I once trusted. The urge was strong, familiar, but when I tried to retreat into that familiar stillness, it felt artificial, like forcing silence rather than discovering it. I began to notice small signs of life returning in unexpected ways. A brief warmth when someone touched my arm, a sudden tightness in my throat during a quiet conversation, a flicker of irritation that lingered instead of dissolving instantly. None of these felt like insights. They didn't feel like progress. They felt uncertain, raw, unresolved. Sometimes I worried that I was losing something important, losing the stability I had worked so hard to build. Other times, I sensed that what was loosening wasn't stability itself, but the rigid structure I had mistaken for it. But even that thought didn't settle into certainty. I remained suspended in not knowing, in the quiet space between what I used to believe and whatever might exist beyond it. And that space didn't feel peaceful. It felt open, unsteady, alive in a way that had no clear shape. Now, the changes appear in small, ordinary moments. Standing in line at a grocery store, I sometimes notice my chest tighten when someone behind me sighs impatiently. The sensation doesn't overwhelm me, but it doesn't disappear instantly either. It lingers, like a small ripple that takes time to settle. Walking down the street, I occasionally feel a brief warmth when I see something simple. A child laughing, sunlight reflecting off a window. The feeling is faint, almost fragile, and I sometimes worry it will vanish if I look at it too directly. When conversations become tense, I still notice the old impulse to retreat into that familiar neutral quiet. The urge is still there, strong, reliable. It whispers that calmness means stepping back, staying untouched, remaining steady above the turbulence. Sometimes I still follow that impulse. Sometimes I don't. And when I don't, when I allow the discomfort, the awkwardness, the slight emotional friction to remain, I feel something unfamiliar. Not clarity, not peace, just movement. A sense that I am inside the experience rather than observing it from a distance. Even then, uncertainty remains. I don't always know whether I am present or simply entangled. I don't always recognize the difference between calm and withdrawal. There are days when I miss the clean stillness I once trusted. Days when I wish I could return to that flat quiet that felt so stable, so controlled, so certain. But when I imagine standing again at the kitchen sink with my hands under cold water, feeling nothing at all, something inside me hesitates. I remember how silent the room felt, how distant my own body seemed, how the stillness carried no warmth. And now, when silence appears, it doesn't feel empty in the same way. It feels uneven, alive with small sensations I can't fully name. Sometimes it is uncomfortable. Sometimes it is quiet. Sometimes it is both at once. I no longer try to decide which state is better. I don't know if I've moved closer to anything or simply away from something I misunderstood. What I know is only this. When I stand in ordinary moments now, washing my hands, listening to someone speak, sitting alone in a dim room, the stillness I feel is no longer perfectly smooth. There are small movements within it, tiny shifts, faint emotional currents that rise and fall, without resolving into anything clear. And I remain there with them, uncertain, aware that the urge to return to certainty is always nearby, waiting quietly, as familiar as the hum of a refrigerator in the background.